Welcome to Our Weird World. I'm your host, John Henson, and this week, the 7th edition of our Weird Fun Bag. And this one is pretty, this one's pretty wild. So 3 stories, as always, looking at some Atomic Wedgies, Verry Idham Henyansyah, and then we are going to also look at Hollow Earth theory right after the jump. So our story begins with a guy named Cyrus Teed, who was born on October 18th, 1839 in New York. As a child, he was intensely fascinated with physics and electromagnetism, but ended up going on to college to study medicine because that was just a more stable career at that time. But in his free time, he still kept working with electricity and physics and still trying to learn, as much as he could there. And during a side experiment with electricity in 1869, Teed was badly shocked and he ended up passing out. Now, while he was unconscious, apparently this beautiful woman appeared to him and told him that he was the Messiah. So already, the electricity has scrambled his brain. And he's an insane person now. When he woke up, when he came to again, Teed began his new mission to, quote, redeem humanity. And then he changed his name to Koresh, which is technically the Hebrew translation of his first name of Cyrus. I think that's how it goes. But if we have learned anything from history, people named Koresh aren't up to any good. Teed began his redemption campaign by denouncing the idea that the earth revolved around the sun. And, that's going back to pre-science times, which is very ironic considering he is a very brilliant scientist. But he's he totally, rejects the heliocentric view of the universe. He goes back to thinking that everything revolves around the earth, like people did before they understood how science worked. And then he took that a step further by proclaiming that human beings were actually living on the inside of the earth rather than the outside of the earth, right? How we're on this giant sphere, this giant ball, and we're living on the outside of the ball. We're on the surface of the ball. Teed, right? He thinks that that's not what's happening. He thinks we're inside of the ball. And so if you think flat earthers are super stupid, get ready for this. All right. So he thinks now that everybody's living inside of this ball and that the sun was just this massive battery operated machine that provided light for one half of the day, and that the stars were just refractions of its light when the battery was just somewhere else inside the sphere. I don't fully understand how that worked. He preached his other beliefs to whoever would listen, which came to be known as Koreshanity. He preached about reincarnation, celibacy, immortality, and communism. In 1894, Teed's followers, which had formed various communes in New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, began moving to Estero, a small community near Fort Myers, Florida, kind of along the Gulf Coast there towards the bottom, south of Tampa. And the fact that he had gotten these communities together in these massive cities is already insane to me. But he moves them all down to Estero, where he was planning to form the New Jerusalem. And for, people who aren't familiar with that terminology, theology, when Jesus comes back, he's going to establish the New Jerusalem. He's going to build his own gated community, more or less, on earth, and everybody's going to live happily ever after. But they got to work on it, and over the next decade, the Koreshians built a bakery, a general store, a concrete mill. Is it a mill? Concrete works, a power plant. They started publishing their own newspaper, and they established their own college. And by 1908, the town had 250 residents and actually covered 100 square miles, which made it the fifth largest city in the country by land area at the time, which is insane. Not surprisingly, though, Teed had a lot of critics, but he was determined to prove that his hollow earth theory was totally legit and was the real thing. So technically, he did not come up with it. It was actually devised back in 1692 by Edmund Halley, who was an English astronomer who somehow found enough time to remove his head from his own butt to accurately compute the orbit for the famous comet that now bears his name, Halley's Comet, which I think, was that the comet that appeared in the 90s? Maybe, I think it was that one, or maybe it was in the 60s, something. But there was that comet. And this dude who literally studied space also believed that everybody was living inside the Earth. And I don't know how you could be so accurate and so wrong at the same time. Halley himself believed that obviously the Earth was not a solid rock, but was rather like this hollow shell with a 500-mile thick layer on the inside where people were walking or whatever. And then two more inner shells and then a core beneath that. And so each shell was then separated by its own atmosphere, and each shell also had its own set of magnetic poles. So essentially, he thinks Earth is this weird Russian nesting doll of rocks inside of rocks that has their own atmosphere. And look, that might be true on an even bigger scale, right? We know what's inside the Earth. There's not another there's not another tiny Earth inside our current Earth with its own atmosphere and people living inside it. That's not the case. But we don't know what's beyond the walls of space. Maybe that's something else. We don't know. But I can guarantee you that's not what Edmund Halley was thinking. He was thinking that we're just on a ball inside a ball, then there's some other balls inside those balls or something. I don't know. But he believed that each sphere inside, the Earth's Russian nesting doll was rotating at a different speed, which not entirely untrue, right? We do know that our core, the Earth's core, rotates and it changes speeds from time to time. There have been some articles about that. Even more, Halley believed that each inner sphere was illuminated and that holes in the outer shell allowed the light to escape, which is what he used to explain the aurora borealis. And forget that auroras are caused by charged particles released by the sun and interacting with Earth's electromagnetic field. That it was super vague shell holes, you guys, for sure. It's light coming from inside other holes in the Earth from other worlds inside the spheres and stuff. I don't know. Teed's theory, however, Cyrus Teed took this and he's like, Edmund Halley's brilliant. Couple of things I would fix about it. And so he did. Teed believed that the entire planet as we knew it was actually located inside a single sphere. So he did not ascribe to Halley's Russian nesting doll kind of model. But whereas how there's this kind of cartoon trope that you could dig a hole into the Earth and eventually end up in China if you just kept digging. Teed did not believe that. Instead, he believed that the other side of the world was in the opposite direction. So basically, rather than digging a hole and then showing up in China, Teed believed that you could launch a rocket straight up into the air and then you would eventually land in China. And no, That's not how it works. But Teed totally thought that this was real, and he was going to prove it. And so he enlisted the help of Professor Ulysses Grant Morrow, who was a teacher at the Koreshan College, to come up with an experiment to verify this theory. In 1897, Morrow produced a massive instrument that he had created called the rectilineator, which was designed to measure the curvature of the Earth. And that's great, because this would, in some way, also disprove flat Earth theory. But they're trying to go the opposite way. But they took the instrument's parts down to the beach near Naples and spent the next month putting it back together to conduct their experiment. And this experiment, known as the Koreshan Geodetic Survey, was supposed to show that the Earth's surface curved upward at a rate of 8 inches per mile. Right. And we know that this is ridiculous because the Earth's curvature would curve downward because we're sitting on the outer edge of a sphere. And so I guess because if you're still on the bottom, it would still curve downward because of how you're positioned. Anyway, it's mind bending, but that's how it works. Where are we at? This is more complicated than I thought it would be explaining. If Teed's hypothesis was true, basically how this experiment would work is that they had this giant line, like a giant stick, basically, that they would extend out, and that if the Earth curved upward, their line would then touch the water roughly 4 miles off the coast, because that would mean that the surface is beginning to curve upward. And so that, for like mathematical terms, that the surface of the Earth would be concave rather than like convex. But because the rectilineator was only 12 feet long, they basically had to move it and recalibrate it every 12 feet in order to repeat the experiment over the 4-mile distance. Now, of the many gigantic flaws in Teed's logic, perhaps the most obvious was the fact that if the entire surface of the Earth was indeed on an inverse curve, why could they not have just done the experiment along the beach and gotten the same result rather than trying to go out into the choppy waters of the Gulf of Mexico to try? Like, you could literally just walk along the beach and eventually you'll get your curve upward, right? Because it's not like I almost understand going backwards, because not doing it going like towards the mainland because of how you could, the dunes would come up, or just as the land rises naturally, based on sea levels. But if he had just gone along the beach, he could have almost made it work in a kind of a weird way, maybe. I don't know. But he didn't. They went right out into the ocean. So Teed and Professor Morrow get into this boat and recalibrate the instrument every 12 feet, which had to be super difficult because of how the boat was bobbing up and down with the waves. Probably trying to measure every 12 feet was a little bit difficult because the boat would kind of keep floating. I don't know. But 5 months after the experiment began, Teed actually announced that the rectilineator had in fact touched the water 4 miles out. He also swore, he's like, guys, it definitely never broke and it definitely never touched the wave. But no one in Florida cared. Like, everyone ignored him. They all knew he was crazy. They didn't believe him. And because honestly, it's easy to go 4 miles out in the ocean and claim whatever you want to happen happened. But Cyrus Teed was pretty satisfied with this. And so after the experiment, the Koreshans moved on to more civil matters and actually tried to incorporate the community of Estero into a standard city in the state of Florida. Despite some opposition from nearby residents, the Koreans actually won, and the town of Estero was officially born and officially recognized by the Florida government. They then began to try to use their sizable influence to affect political decisions in nearby Naples, but the residents of Naples were not about to let a bunch of communist weirdos who thought they were living inside of an earth ball about to influence their government. They got really annoyed, actually. During one altercation between the Koreans and the people of Naples, Cyrus Teed was severely beaten and actually died from those injuries. But Teed, being the cult leader, kind of, telling people he was the Messiah, that he was, he told his congregation that he was immortal and that if he ever died, he would just resurrect himself like Jesus did. And thinking that there was no way he was possibly lying about all of that, the Koreans actually held Teed's body for 3 days. But after that third day, his body began showing signs of decay, and the county coroner was actually forced to step in and force them to bury the body. 2 years later, a hurricane came through, destroyed Teed's tomb, and actually swept his coffin out to sea. And after that, the Korean community just kind of slowly began to lose membership, and they eventually withered away. And the colony was deeded to the state of Florida in 1961. Without much use for the land that they had cultivated, the state actually turned the area into a historic site. And today, if you're down in the Fort Myers, Naples area, you can visit the Korean State Historic Site, where if you've just literally crossed everything off of your list to visit in Florida, you can go and see what's left of a few remaining 19th century homes that basically look like the set of The Village. That M. Night Shyamalan movie where there's just this weird village out in the middle of nowhere and some crazy stuff happens. But there's also a nature trail and a playground for kids, because every good parent lets their kids play at the site of an old religious cult, right? Come on, kids, let's go learn some history. Fun fact, though, about the Koreans, and then we'll move on. The next two stories are pretty short. Even though no one in Florida or even the rest of the United States at the time really cared about the rectilineator experiment, there was one group of people who later found out about this and really started looking into it, and that was the Nazis. Shockingly enough, in their quest to completely screw the entire planet over, the Nazis actually investigated Teed's claims, because if Teed was true, it would have actually allowed the Nazis to spy on the United States by simply pointing a giant telescope towards the sky. and they totally believed it for a while. They had all of these plans laid out. If you know anything about the Nazi regime, they were doing all kinds of crazy stuff. They were trying to build these weird futuristic weapons. They were trying to go and find maybe not the Ark of the Covenant. I think it was the Ark of the Covenant. I don't know. But Hitler had some of his top aides going all around to Africa and the Middle East, trying to find all of these ancient treasures to use to rule the world, all kinds of just insane stuff. But the Nazis eventually realized this was too crazy even for their standards, and they abandoned that project. So our next story here is of Verry Idham Henyansyah. His name is literally Verry, it's Verry. And this was a strange dude. No one really thought much of him other than he was just a gay guy, which brought shame to his family, because he was living in, I think it's Indonesia at the time. Yeah, Indonesia. And being gay in Indonesia is not good. You don't want to do that, because the government's very much against that. But in 2006, Verry started killing people, because what else was he going to do? When one of his victims' bodies was found along the side of the road near Jakarta after being hacked to pieces with a crowbar, which is impressive, police realized they had a very maniacal killer on their hands. Somehow, mainly because like Indonesians don't care too much about journalism, we don't have a lot of details about all of the people that he killed or how he got murdered, but Verry was eventually arrested and happily confessed to the murders. He told police that he buried several bodies in his backyard, most of whom were fellow gay men like himself. One of his victims included a gay man who had offered him money and a car to have sex with his boyfriend. So Verry meets this dude, and this dude's like, hey, I'm going to pay you, I'm going to give you a car, and you can go have sex with my boyfriend. Just maybe don't kill me. And you can't do that because even though Verry was gay, he wasn't a prostitute. And you're not going to pay him to do those things. That's insulting. So he's going to kill you. While in police custody, and this is why this story is so strange, Verry thought it was perfectly acceptable to just start singing to everyone, including the security officers and his fellow inmates. Even stranger, they were totally into it. Like, so much so that Verry recorded and released a pop album titled My Last Performance in 2009 under the stage name Ryan. And I wish I could play a clip from that because it's probably really bad, but it is next to impossible to find anything like any of those recordings. There's like a couple of documentaries about this guy, but like no one has the actual recording as far as I can tell of his album. The next year, despite being very gay, Verry announced that he was getting married to Ini Wijawa, who was a convicted drug dealer and also a female that he had met while in prison. When asked why he was doing this, Verry admitted that he basically just wanted to make his mother happy and fulfill her life's wish that he marry a woman. Ini was released from prison later that year, but at least as of today, as of this recording, Verry is still on death row, mostly for being gay, because in Indonesia, I think that's higher up on the crime list than actually being a serial killer, but he's in there for both. Our last story here, another short one, happened in 2015 as Kitty makes his return to the bag. It's been so many episodes since Kitty has ruffled the bag that I'm not even mad about it. But Brad Davis and his father, Denver St. Clair, were drinking together one night in Oklahoma. But, as most step-parent relationships in Oklahoma tend to go, the two got into a very heated argument once they got nice and drunk. St. Clair began talking about his skank hoe of an ex-wife, which would have been fine, except that woman was Brad Davis's mother. So here's the thing. I mean, and maybe it's one of those situations where like St. Clair had basically come in and had been basically the father to Brad Davis. I don't know, but Brad was not about to let Denver start talking about his mother. And so a war of words ensued. Denver threw a punch at Brad, but he missed. And then Brad, a former Marine and trained killer, which you don't want to do that, he jumped on top of Denver, started just laying these repeated blows down into Denver's head. And when Denver became incapacitated, Brad reached down into the back of Denver's pants and grabbed the elastic waistband around Denver's tighty-whities and yanked them all the way up and over Denver's head. And this sounds like a cartoon plot. It's not. This really happened. And he didn't stop there. The elastic waist, because like by now the waistband had been ripped from the rest of the underwear. And so Brad then wrapped the waistband around Denver's neck and choked him to death. Brad pleaded guilty to manslaughter by way of an atomic wedgie. Autopsy report added that blunt force trauma to the head contributed to the death, but this is, as far as I know, the only recorded instance of someone being murdered by a wedgie. All right, the 7th edition of the Weird Fun Bag in the books, and I wish there was more about Cyrus Teed's story, because I mean, that could literally be its own episode, but just another strange collection of stories. So let's recap and see what we learned today.
What did we learn?
Number one, Cyrus Teed thought that we lived inside the Earth and that you could essentially point a telescope up into the air and see to the other side of the world, see what the Chinese were up to. That's wrong, all right? You thought flat Earth was stupid. This is somehow even dumber. Number two, Verry Idham Henyansyah, a gay Indonesian serial killer who started singing to everyone in jail and got so popular that he was able to record an album and gain some popularity from that. And then lastly, 2016, the only known instance, or 2015, sorry, the only known instance of someone being murdered by an atomic wedgie. Next week on Our Weird World, we do have someone whose story is big enough, unlike Cyrus Teed, to devote an entire episode to. And we are going to look at the story of Grigory Rasputin, one of those famous figures from history. People have heard the name, but probably don't know the full story behind it. But we are going to look at it next week. So that's going to do it here this week. Thank you so much for continuing to listen. Keep telling all your friends. I almost forgot the way I end the show, but keep it weird. I got that real good, feel good stuff up under the seat of my big black jacked up truck, rolling on 35s, pretty girl by my side. You got that suntan skirt and boots, waiting on you to look my way and scoot your little hot self over here. Girl, hand me another beer. Might sit down on my diamond plate tailgate, put in my country rock hip hop mixtape. Little Conway, a little T-Pain, might just make it rain. You can hang your t-shirt on a limb, hit that bank, and we can ease on in. Soak us up a little moonlight. You know I know what you like. Yeah. All them other boys want to wine you up and take you downtown, but you look like the kind that likes to take it way out. Out where the corn rows grow, row, row my boat, floating down the Flint River. Catch us up a little catfish dinner. Gonna sound like a winner when I lay you down and love you right. Yeah, that's my kind of night.